You've been in therapy for months talking about your relationship patterns, and still nothing seems to stick. You understand your attachment styles, you know your triggers, you can analyze your past with surgical precision, but when it comes to actually letting someone in, to feeling that raw, unfiltered connection, something inside you keeps pulling back. It's like watching yourself from the outside, seeing every defense mechanism activate the moment vulnerability knocks on your door. You've become so good at understanding love that you've forgotten how to feel it. Your mind has turned into this sophisticated analysis machine that dissects every romantic moment before your heart can even register what's happening. And the most frustrating part, the more emotionally intelligent you become, the more isolated you feel. You know exactly what you should do, what you should say, how you should respond, but it all feels rehearsed, calculated, safe. You're trapped in a glass box of emotional maturity, able to see love clearly but unable to touch it, without your intellect interfering. Every relationship feels like a performance where you're playing the role of someone who knows how to love, rather than someone who actually loves. You find yourself attracted to people who trigger your analysis mode, who present interesting psychological puzzles to solve, while the simple, uncomplicated connections that could actually nurture your soul feel boring or beneath your evolved understanding. This emotional paradox isn't just affecting your romantic relationships, it's seeping into every corner of your life. Your friendships feel surface level because you're constantly managing impressions and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Your family interactions become exercises in psychological management rather than genuine connection. You've become so aware of manipulation, codependency, and unhealthy dynamics that you've built walls around the very experiences that make life meaningful. You're like a person who studied fire so extensively that they're afraid to get warm. The knowledge that was supposed to liberate you has become a prison. You can see through everyone's motives, predict their behaviors, understand their wounds. But this X-ray vision into human nature has left you feeling separate from the very species you understand so well. You're too smart for your own heart. Your emotional maturity has become emotional isolation. You've reached a level of psychological sophistication that makes authentic spontaneity feel naive and dangerous. Every impulse to love freely gets filtered through your advanced understanding of how relationships work, how people get hurt, how vulnerability can be weaponized. You've become a relationship expert who can't experience relationships. You know the theory of intimacy, but you've lost access to its practice. What Jean Piaget discovered in his decades of studying cognitive development reveals exactly why this happens and why some of the most emotionally evolved people struggle the most with deep, authentic love. His groundbreaking research shows that the same mental processes that make us psychologically sophisticated can actually interfere with our capacity for genuine emotional connection. Today, I'm going to show you how the highest levels of cognitive development can create barriers to love, why emotional maturity sometimes works against emotional spontaneity, and the specific mechanisms Piaget identified that explain this painful paradox that so many conscious, self-aware people experience. You'll understand why your mind's attempt to protect you from relationship pain has actually created a different kind of suffering, and more importantly, how to recognize when your cognitive sophistication is blocking your heart's intelligence. In the summer of 1921, Jean Piaget sat in a small classroom in Geneva, Switzerland, watching a 7-year-old girl named Marie struggle with what seemed like a simple task. He had placed 2 identical glasses filled with the same amount of water in front of her, and she confirmed they contained equal amounts. Then, as Marie watched, Piaget poured the water from one glass into a tall, thin container. When he asked if the containers still held the same amount of water, Marie insisted the tall container now held more water because the level was higher. What fascinated Piaget wasn't that Marie was wrong. It was that she was absolutely certain she was right, and no amount of logical explanation could convince her otherwise. Her cognitive development hadn't yet reached the stage where she could understand conservation, the principle that quantity remains the same despite changes in appearance. But what Piaget observed next changed everything he thought he knew about human development. As Marie grew older and developed the cognitive ability to understand conservation, something unexpected happened. She became increasingly hesitant to trust her immediate perceptions. She would look at the containers, pause, analyze, consider multiple variables before answering. Her spontaneous confidence had been replaced by analytical caution. She was now intellectually correct, but emotionally distant from her own experience. This pattern appeared again and again in Piaget's research. Children who developed sophisticated cognitive abilities often lost their capacity for immediate, intuitive responses to their environment. They gained the ability to think about thinking, but this metacognitive awareness created a buffer between them and direct experience. Piaget realized he was witnessing something profound about human consciousness, the development of abstract thinking, while intellectually liberating, could interfere with emotional immediacy. The same mental sophistication that allowed children to solve complex problems also made them question their spontaneous feelings and impulses. They learned to think before they felt, to analyze before they responded, to understand before they experienced. This cognitive advancement was clearly beneficial for academic learning and social adaptation, but Piaget began to suspect it might come with hidden costs in terms of authentic emotional expression and connection. Consider Antoine, a 12-year-old boy Piaget studied during his formal operational stage research. Antoine had developed the ability to think hypothetically, to consider multiple possibilities, to engage in abstract reasoning. When Piaget presented him with social scenarios, Antoine could analyze them from numerous perspectives, predict various outcomes, and propose sophisticated solutions. But when Piaget observed Antoine interacting with his peers during unstructured play, something striking emerged. Antoine struggled to engage spontaneously. He would stand at the edge of group activities, clearly analyzing the social dynamics, understanding the unspoken rules, predicting how different actions might unfold. His advanced cognitive abilities allowed him to see the social chess game that his friends were unconsciously playing. But this insight paralyzed him. While his friends laughed, argued, and connected through immediate emotional responses, Antoine remained trapped in analysis mode. He understood friendship better than his peers, but he experienced it less fully. His cognitive sophistication had created emotional distance. He could think about relationships, but he struggled to be in them. Piaget documented similar patterns across different developmental stages. Children who advanced quickly through the stages of cognitive development often showed what he called metacognitive interference in their emotional and social experiences. They became observers of their own mental processes, which made them more self-aware but less spontaneous. They developed what Piaget termed reflective abstraction, the ability to think about their own thinking. But this created a layer of mental activity that stood between them and immediate experience. These children could analyze their feelings instead of simply feeling them. They could understand their reactions instead of simply having them. They became psychologically sophisticated but emotionally distanced from their own inner lives. The most profound example in Piaget's research involved a teenage girl named Claudette, who had reached full formal operational thinking by age 15. Claudette could engage in complex hypothetical reasoning, understand abstract principles, and think systematically about possibilities that didn't yet exist. Her intellectual abilities were remarkable. But when Piaget interviewed her about her relationships with friends and family, a troubling pattern emerged. Claudette described feeling like she was watching her own life from the outside. She could understand why she should feel certain emotions in particular situations, but the feelings themselves seemed muted, filtered through layers of analysis. When her friends shared their excitement about crushes or their sadness about disappointments, Claudette found herself studying their emotions rather than resonating with them. She understood what they were experiencing better than they did, but she felt disconnected from the raw reality of those experiences. Her advanced cognitive development had given her insight into human psychology, but it had also created a barrier between her and her own psychological life. This phenomenon becomes even more complex when we examine how formal operational thinking interacts with emotional attachment systems. Piaget noticed that adolescents who developed sophisticated abstract reasoning abilities often struggled with what he called emotional object permanence. Just as young children need to develop the cognitive understanding that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, emotionally mature individuals often struggle to maintain the felt sense of connection with others when they're not physically present. Their advanced minds understand intellectually that relationships persist across time and space, but their emotional experience becomes contingent on constant cognitive confirmation. They lose the ability to feel connected without thinking about connection. They can't trust the invisible threads that bind them to others unless they can rationally verify those connections. Imagine Sarah, a brilliant graduate student in psychology, who came to understand this pattern in her own life. She had always been praised for her emotional intelligence, her ability to understand complex relationship dynamics, her skill in helping friends navigate their personal struggles. She could see patterns that others missed, predict relationship outcomes with uncanny accuracy, and offer insights that helped people understand themselves better. But in her own romantic relationships, Sarah felt like she was performing a role rather than being herself. She would catch herself analyzing her boyfriend's behavior instead of simply enjoying his company. She found herself predicting problems before they occurred, managing dynamics before they became issues, understanding the relationship better than she experienced it. Her cognitive sophistication had turned love into a subject to be studied rather than an experience to be lived. She knew everything about healthy relationships, but had lost access to the simple pleasure of being in one. Sarah's struggle illustrates what Piaget identified as the core tension in advanced cognitive development. The same mental abilities that allow us to understand complex systems, solve abstract problems, and navigate sophisticated social environments can also create distance between us and immediate experience. When we develop the capacity to think about our emotions, we often lose some ability to simply have emotions. When we learn to analyze our relationships, we sometimes forget how to simply be in them. The observer mind, which Piaget saw as the pinnacle of cognitive achievement, can interfere with the experiencer mind, which is essential for authentic emotional connection. This cognitive interference becomes particularly pronounced in the realm of love, because love, in its essence, requires a kind of intelligent surrender that advanced thinking minds find threatening. Love asks us to trust feelings we can't fully analyze, to commit to outcomes we can't predict, to be vulnerable in ways our sophisticated understanding tells us is dangerous. The emotionally mature mind sees all the ways love can go wrong, understands all the psychological pitfalls, recognizes all the red flags and warning signs. This knowledge, while protective, can also be paralyzing. It's like having a fire safety expert live in your head, constantly warning about the dangers of getting too close to the flame, even when warmth is exactly what your soul needs. Piaget observed that children who developed metacognitive awareness early often experienced what he called existential loneliness, a sense of being separated from others by the intensity of their own self-awareness. They could understand other people's mental states through theory of mind, but this understanding created a gulf between their inner experience and others' experiences. They became aware that everyone lives in their own subjective reality, which paradoxically made them feel more alone in their own subjective reality. The gift of psychological insight became a barrier to psychological connection. They could see into others' minds, but this X-ray vision made authentic meeting more difficult, not easier. You know this feeling intimately because you've experienced how emotional awareness can sometimes feel like emotional imprisonment. You recognize the irony of understanding yourself so well that you've lost touch with yourself. You see how your sophisticated grasp of relationship dynamics has made simple connection feel impossible. You feel the weight of knowing too much about how emotions work to trust your emotions completely. You've become fluent in the language of psychology, but you've lost some fluency in the language of the heart. And this isn't a personal failing. It's a predictable consequence of advanced cognitive development that Piaget documented systematically throughout his career. The most painful aspect of this phenomenon is that it often affects people who are genuinely committed to emotional growth and authentic connection. These are not individuals who are avoiding intimacy out of fear or immaturity. These are people who have done the work, who understand themselves deeply, who have developed emotional intelligence and self-awareness, but their very commitment to understanding love has sometimes created obstacles to experiencing love. They've become so skilled at the meta level of relationship awareness that they struggle with the ground level of relationship experience. They can think about being present, but they have difficulty simply being present. They understand mindfulness conceptually, but struggle to access mindful states naturally. Their cognitive advancement has created what Piaget would call a problem of integration between their intellectual and experiential capacities. This creates a particularly modern form of suffering, because our culture tends to equate emotional intelligence with emotional capacity. We assume that understanding emotions leads to experiencing emotions more fully, that awareness automatically creates access. But Piaget's research suggests the relationship is more complex. Awareness can enhance experience, but it can also interfere with experience. Understanding can deepen feeling, but it can also distance us from feeling. The development of emotional intelligence doesn't automatically translate into emotional fluency. Sometimes it creates emotional self-consciousness that gets in the way of emotional spontaneity. And you know this viscerally because you've lived it. You've felt how your sophisticated understanding of relationships can make relating feel artificial. You've experienced how your emotional vocabulary can sometimes substitute for emotional experience rather than enhance it. Let me ask you something that might touch a nerve that's been quietly aching for too long. Do you remember the last time you fell in love without immediately starting to analyze the experience? Can you recall feeling something so pure and immediate that your mind didn't rush in to categorize it, understand it, manage it, or protect you from it? I know how exhausting it is to live with a mind that's always trying to figure out your own heart before your heart has a chance to speak. You're not broken for feeling this way. You're not overthinking because you're anxious or damaged. You're experiencing the natural tension between sophisticated consciousness and spontaneous connection that Piaget identified as one of the most challenging aspects of advanced cognitive development. If this resonates with the ache you carry, leave a comment with just these words. I analyze love instead of feeling it. Your honesty might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to feel less alone in this particular kind of intelligent loneliness. You have more healing power than you realize, especially for others who love with their minds instead of their hearts. The children in Piaget's later studies, who showed the most advanced formal operational thinking, often displayed what he called cognitive emotional dissociation. They could discuss their feelings with remarkable sophistication, but they struggled to access the feelings themselves in real time. They became experts in emotional theory while novices in emotional practice. This wasn't due to trauma or pathology. It was a predictable outcome of cognitive advancement. Their minds had developed pattern recognition systems so sophisticated that they could see the architecture of their own emotional experiences. But this architectural awareness interfered with their ability to simply inhabit the emotional experience. They became emotionally self-conscious in ways that made natural emotional flow more difficult. Think about how this plays out in adult relationships. Someone with advanced emotional intelligence might recognize that they're feeling vulnerable in a moment with their partner. But instead of simply experiencing and expressing that vulnerability, they begin to analyze it. They consider whether the vulnerability is appropriate, whether their partner can handle it, whether expressing it serves the relationship's long-term health. They think about their attachment style, their partner's attachment style, the timing, the context, the potential outcomes. By the time they've finished this internal consultation, the moment of authentic vulnerability has passed. They've managed the feeling instead of experiencing it, understood it instead of sharing it. Their emotional sophistication has protected them from the risks of authentic expression, but it's also protected them from the rewards. This pattern becomes particularly complex in long-term relationships where both partners have high emotional intelligence. They can discuss their relationship with the sophistication of trained therapists, analyzing patterns, identifying triggers, implementing healthy communication strategies. But sometimes their relationship becomes so well managed that it loses its aliveness. They're relating to their understanding of each other instead of relating to each other directly. They love the version of their partner that exists in their psychological framework rather than the unpredictable, unanalyzed person standing in front of them. Their relationship becomes a successful psychological project rather than a living emotional reality. Piaget's research suggests that this challenge intensifies with age because our cognitive abilities continue developing while our capacity for spontaneous emotional experience can actually diminish if we don't actively protect it. Adults who have spent years developing emotional intelligence, studying relationship dynamics, and understanding psychological patterns often find themselves increasingly distant from the simple emotional responses that once came naturally. They've learned so much about how emotions work that they've forgotten how to let emotions work through them. They understand the river of feeling, but they've lost the ability to simply swim in it. The most sophisticated form of this challenge appears in individuals who work in helping professions or who have done extensive personal growth work. They've developed extraordinary abilities to understand and support others' emotional experiences, but they struggle to have their own emotional experiences without immediately shifting into helper, analyst, or observer mode. They can see through surface presentations to underlying emotional realities, but this X-ray vision makes it difficult for them to be moved by surface presentations. They understand the psychology behind romantic gestures, so the gestures themselves lose some of their power to touch them. They can analyze the dynamics behind emotional expressions, so the expressions themselves feel less immediate and impactful. Their professional or personal development has given them tools to understand love, but these same tools can interfere with their ability to be surprised, moved, or transformed by love. This creates what Piaget would recognize as a developmental paradox. The cognitive abilities that make us more effective at understanding and supporting others can make us less effective at connecting with ourselves and others authentically. The metacognitive skills that help us navigate complex social situations can create obstacles to simple human connection. We become so skilled at thinking about experience that we struggle to simply have experience. We develop emotional intelligence at the expense of emotional immediacy. We gain psychological insight, but lose psychological innocence. And this loss is real. It's not just about nostalgia for simpler times or romanticizing emotional naivety. There's something valuable about the capacity for immediate, unreflective emotional response that sophisticated consciousness can interfere with. Consider the way children fall in love with people, with activities, with ideas. They don't analyze compatibility or long-term potential or psychological health. They feel attraction and they move toward it. They experience joy and they express it. They feel hurt and they show it. Their emotional responses are immediate, authentic, and often beautifully proportionate to the actual stimulus, rather than to their understanding of what the stimulus might mean or lead to. They live in their emotions rather than thinking about their emotions. They trust their immediate responses rather than analyzing whether those responses are wise or appropriate or strategically sound. Adults with high emotional intelligence often lose this capacity not because they're damaged, but because they've developed sophisticated pattern recognition systems that automatically engage whenever emotions arise. They can't feel excited about a new relationship without also seeing potential red flags. They can't experience attraction without also analyzing compatibility. They can't feel love without also considering whether that love is healthy, sustainable, and appropriately boundaried. Their emotional intelligence has become emotionally interfering intelligence. This phenomenon is particularly painful for people who genuinely want deep connection, because their sophisticated understanding of what creates healthy relationships can actually interfere with their ability to create healthy relationships. They know that successful partnerships require trust, so they analyze whether their impulse to trust is wise. They understand that intimacy requires vulnerability, so they carefully consider whether each moment is appropriate for vulnerable expression. They recognize that love requires some level of surrender, so they thoughtfully evaluate whether surrender is safe in each particular context. Their relationship knowledge has become relationship performance anxiety. The tragedy is that these individuals often make excellent partners once they learn to navigate this cognitive emotional tension. They're typically self-aware, thoughtful, committed to growth, and skilled at healthy communication, but they struggle with the messy, irrational, spontaneous aspects of love that can't be managed or understood their way into existence. They can create the conditions for love, but they have difficulty simply falling into love. They can maintain love through conscious choice and commitment, but they struggle with the effortless flow of love that doesn't require maintenance or management. Piaget's research offers hope for this dilemma, because he identified that cognitive development doesn't have to create permanent barriers to immediate experience. The same metacognitive abilities that can interfere with emotional spontaneity can also be used to recognize when cognitive interference is happening and to consciously step back from analysis mode. The key is developing what Piaget called cognitive flexibility, the ability to access different modes of thinking depending on what the situation requires. Just as we can shift between abstract and concrete thinking depending on the task, we can learn to shift between analytical and experiential modes depending on what will serve us best in the moment. The individuals in Piaget's studies who maintained access to both sophisticated reasoning and immediate experience had learned to recognize when their analytical capabilities were helpful and when they were interfering. They could engage their metacognitive abilities when solving problems, making important decisions or reflecting on patterns, but they could also disengage those abilities when the situation called for spontaneous response, creative expression, or authentic emotional connection. They had developed what might be called appropriate cognitive control rather than automatic cognitive dominance. This requires a kind of metacognitive awareness, the ability to think about when to think and when not to think about thinking. It means recognizing that emotional intelligence includes knowing when not to analyze emotions, when not to understand them, when not to manage them, but simply to experience them. It means understanding that relationship intelligence includes knowing when not to think about the relationship, when not to process dynamics, when not to optimize interactions, but simply to be present with another person without agenda or analysis. This brings us to perhaps Piaget's most profound insight about cognitive development and its relationship to emotional capacity. He discovered that children who develop exceptional cognitive abilities often do so by creating what he called cognitive islands, isolated areas of advanced thinking that become disconnected from their emotional and social development. These children learn to solve complex problems, to think abstractly, to analyze and categorize, but they do so by compartmentalizing their cognitive abilities away from their emotional experiences. The result is an adult who can think about love but struggles to feel it, who can analyze relationships but has difficulty inhabiting them. Piaget observed this phenomenon most clearly in his work with gifted children in Geneva. He noticed that children who excelled in mathematical and logical reasoning often struggled with what he termed emotional conservation, the ability to maintain emotional connection across different contexts and experiences. Just as a child must learn that the amount of water remains the same when poured from a wide container to a narrow one, emotionally mature adults must learn that love remains constant even when its expression changes form. But for those who developed cognitive sophistication as a defense against emotional overwhelm, this emotional conservation becomes nearly impossible. The irony is devastating. The very intelligence that allows these individuals to understand love conceptually becomes the barrier that prevents them from experiencing it fully. They can read about attachment theory, understand the neuroscience of bonding, analyze their own patterns and triggers, but when faced with the actual experience of vulnerability required for deep love, their cognitive sophistication kicks in as a protective mechanism. They begin to think rather than feel, to analyze rather than experience, to manage rather than surrender. This creates what Piaget identified as a cognitive emotional dissociation, a split between thinking and feeling that becomes so automatic it feels natural. These individuals often report feeling like they're watching their relationships from the outside, understanding what's happening, but unable to fully participate in the emotional reality of the connection. They become experts at talking about feelings without actually feeling them, at analyzing intimacy without experiencing it, at understanding love without being transformed by it. The path back to emotional integration, according to Piaget's later work, requires what he called cognitive regression, a deliberate return to earlier, more intuitive ways of processing experience. This doesn't mean becoming less intelligent or abandoning critical thinking. Instead, it means learning to access different types of intelligence for different situations. It means developing what we might call emotional courage, the willingness to not understand, to not analyze, to not control, but simply to be present with whatever arises in the space between two people. Piaget discovered that this process often begins with what he termed tolerated confusion, the ability to remain present with experiences that cannot be immediately categorized or understood. For emotionally mature minds accustomed to clarity and comprehension, this confusion feels dangerous, even intolerable. Their instinct is to think their way through it, to create frameworks and explanations that restore cognitive comfort. But love, in its deepest form, exists in the spaces between thoughts, in the moments of not knowing, in the willingness to be confused and vulnerable and uncertain. The adults who successfully navigate this transition, Piaget observed, often go through what appears to be a temporary loss of their cognitive sophistication. They report feeling stupid around love, unable to access their usual analytical abilities when it comes to matters of the heart. This perceived regression is actually a sign of healthy development, the integration of cognitive and emotional intelligence rather than their continued separation. They're learning to think with their hearts and feel with their minds, creating a more holistic way of engaging with intimate relationships. But this integration requires grieving the loss of cognitive control that has served as protection for so long. Many emotionally mature individuals have built their entire identity around their ability to understand, to analyze, to figure things out. The prospect of loving deeply requires them to release this identity, to become beginners again in the realm of emotion, to admit that their greatest strength might also be their greatest limitation when it comes to intimate connection. Piaget's research revealed that this process cannot be rushed or forced through willpower alone. The cognitive defenses that prevent deep love didn't develop overnight, and they cannot be dismantled through analysis or understanding. Instead, the path forward requires what he called experiential learning, the gradual repeated experience of being emotionally present without immediately retreating into cognitive processing. This might mean sitting with feelings of vulnerability without immediately analyzing them, staying present during conflict without immediately strategizing solutions, or allowing love to be felt without immediately questioning its sustainability or meaning. The transformation Piaget documented in his later subjects was remarkable. Individuals who had spent decades feeling emotionally disconnected despite their sophisticated understanding of relationships began to experience what they described as emotional aliveness for the first time in their adult lives. They reported feeling like they were finally inhabiting their own emotional experiences rather than observing them from a distance. Their relationships became more spontaneous, more authentic, more deeply satisfying, even as they became less predictable and controllable. This doesn't mean abandoning intellectual sophistication or emotional awareness. Rather, it means learning when to engage these capacities and when to set them aside in service of deeper connection. It means developing what Piaget called meta-emotional intelligence, the wisdom to know when emotions need to be understood and when they simply need to be experienced, when relationships need to be analyzed and when they need to be lived. The individuals who master this integration often become the most profound lovers, not despite their intellectual sophistication, but because they've learned to use it in service of emotional depth rather than as protection from it. They bring both clarity and mystery to their relationships, both understanding and wonder, both wisdom and innocence. They've learned that true emotional maturity isn't about having all the answers about love, but about being willing to live within love's questions. If you recognize yourself in this exploration, know that you're not broken or defective. Your struggle to love deeply isn't a personal failing, but a natural consequence of cognitive development that prioritized understanding over experiencing. The very intelligence that sometimes feels like a barrier to love can become its greatest ally once you learn to use it differently. You have the capacity not just to understand love, but to be transformed by it. Not just to analyze intimacy, but to create it, not just to think about connection, but to embody it fully. The journey from cognitive sophistication to emotional integration isn't about becoming less intelligent. It's about becoming more human. It's about learning that the heart has its own wisdom that complements rather than competes with mental understanding. It's about discovering that true emotional maturity includes the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to be confused, and the strength to love without guarantees. If this conversation has stirred something in you, if you're ready to explore what it means to love with both your mind and your heart fully engaged, I invite you to continue this journey with me. Every week, I share insights that can help you navigate the complex intersection of intellectual sophistication and emotional authenticity. These aren't quick fixes or simple solutions, but deep explorations of what it means to be fully human in relationship with others. This is more than just information. It's a community of people committed to growing beyond the limitations that their greatest strengths have created. Together, we're learning that true intelligence includes emotional wisdom, that real sophistication includes the capacity for simplicity, and that genuine maturity includes the courage to be vulnerable. Your presence here, your willingness to question and explore, is exactly what this community needs. Click that subscribe button if you're ready to join a conversation that honors both your intelligence and your heart. Let's continue discovering what becomes possible when we bring our whole selves to the experience of loving and being loved. Next week, we'll explore another fascinating aspect of Piaget's work, how the same cognitive patterns that affect our ability to love also shape our relationship with creativity and spontaneity. You'll discover why highly intelligent individuals often struggle with creative expression, and what Piaget learned about freeing the creative mind from its own sophistication.